Jews, it was his custom to go into a certain part of the forest and to meditate there. Then he would light a big fire in a just certain way, and he would say a special prayer, and he would sing a little something called a nigun. A nigun is a melody with no words, and lo and behold, a miracle would happen, and the terrible threat would be averted. A generation later, when the student of that first rabbi, whose name was the Maggid of Mezrich, saw trouble approaching to threaten the community, and he needed to pray to heaven for protection, he would go to that same place in the forest as did his teacher. But when he got there, he would have to say, Master of the universe, listen, I don't know how to light the fire, but I can sing that little nigun, I can sing that little tune, and I still remember the prayer. And again, the miracle would be accomplished and the threat would be averted. And in the next generation, another rabbi whose name was Moshe Leib of Sassov, and he was the next in the descendant of the Hasidic rabbis, he would go to that same spot in the forest and he would say, Dear God, I don't know how to light that fire, and I don't know the prayer, and even the little song I don't remember so well, but you can see that I know where the place is, and that must be sufficient, right? And you know, it was. It was just enough to be in that place. The miracle was accomplished and the threat was averted. Years later, it fell to Rabbi Yisrael of Rizhin, a student of the former rabbi, to confront the threat again against his community. But he was sitting in his armchair, his head in his hands, and he had to say to God, Master of the universe, I'm unable to light the fire. I don't know the prayer. I can't remember how the song goes, and I can't find that place in the forest. All I can do is tell the story about how the Baal Shem Tov used to go and do those things in that holy place. I remember the story and I honor the story. Please let that be enough. And it was enough. And I wanted to begin with that story because I felt that it really sort of sets a tone for what we do at Passover. There are stories upon stories upon stories that are part of the Passover experience, that are part of the Passover stories. Some of them may have been embellished over the years. Some of them may not have happened at all. Sometimes we make new stories up as in our generations because of new needs, and we'll be talking about how we can do that later on. But when we come to a holiday like Passover, it is up to us to tell the story of Passover, to relate that to our descendants, and to say to them, here are the lessons that we learned from Passover, and here are the lessons that we implement today because of the lessons taught to us by our ancestors. And here are some lessons that you might want to consider for your future. And so that's the reason why we do this. We do this because, not only because it's important to tell stories, and not only because the Bible, that is the Torah, which is the book that we focus on, not only because the Torah says we need to, but because we take those lessons and we implement them today and we use them. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that. First, so let me tell the story of Passover. So this is 40 years in 3 minutes is what I'm going to try to say. And actually, it's not 40 years. This is really more like 400 years in 3 minutes. So first of all, there was this group of people called the Israelites. And the Israelites were really descended from our patriarch Jacob, who of course had Isaac, the patriarch, as a father, and Abraham, the patriarch, as a grandfather, which means he also had Rebekah as a mother, and he had Sarah as a grandmother. And Jacob, along with Rachel and Leah, those three really created 13 beautiful children, 12 of whom we know a lot about. Sadly, the girl among them we don't know a lot about, and that's a problem of the Torah, but that's a separate discussion. Those 12 young men and their descendants became the Israelites. And they escaped hunger in the land of Canaan by seeking food and by seeking residence in the land of Egypt. And one of those brothers, Joseph, actually, had become the Grand Vizier of Egypt through a whole set of circumstances that you can read about in the book of Genesis. And he allowed his family to come and be with him in the land of Egypt. And he was able to bring them into the land, to get food for them, to get a place to live for them. Because when they came down, there was a famine, a worldwide famine, and no one had food. But Joseph's family was able to use their protexia, their influence, and to find food. And the Pharaoh of the land of Egypt in those original days treated Joseph's family very well. And Joseph and Joseph's brothers and even Jacob lived there for a little while before Jacob died. And we became accustomed to living in a diaspora. They became accustomed to living in this land that was not theirs, even though they knew that God had promised to give them a land one day. But as the number of Israelites grew, they appeared to be a threat to the Egyptians. And a new Pharaoh came to power who said, I can't let these people grow in number because perhaps they'll go to war with one of our external enemies and they will overthrow us. So he enslaved them in terms of building projects all over the land. Were they a continuing threat? Possibly, to his mind, that they were. And he tried to eliminate, actually, at some point, he tried to stop the Israelites from breeding by using the tool of death of the male children, because he didn't want the Israelites to grow in number. But the Midrash, and those are the stories that our rabbis tell us, but the stories also say that there's going to be someone who will be a deliverer, and he's going to be a male child born around this time, and you have to kill all the male children because possibly, very possibly, that male child will arise to conquer us. So a lot of people could have been killed, and a lot of young boys probably escaped because their parents hid them. And there was one parent who allowed their child to go and get free from that death sentence, and that one child became the man whom we know as Moses. His mother placed him as an infant in a basket on the river Nile. Floating down the river Nile, he was discovered by a princess of the Pharaoh's court. She adopted him as her own. And he grew up in the royal court, and yet he knew, says the Midrash, says our stories about stories, that he was an Israelite, and he knew his heritage. But he never liked the building projects. He never liked the fact that the Israelites were enslaved to the Egyptians. And one day he saw one Egyptian taskmaster beating an Israelite, killing him. And so Moses killed that Egyptian taskmaster, buried him in the sand. But he then found out that there were witnesses to this crime. And Moses escapes, goes into the desert, becomes a nomad, joins into the tribe of Midian, marries into the tribe of Midian. And while he was a shepherd with the tribe of Midian, he discovers a burning bush. That is a bush who is engulfed in flames, but the bush is not consumed. As we know the stories from the book of Exodus, God was in that burning bush. And God convinces Moses to return to Egypt to be the deliverer, and indeed to deliver the people from Egypt. And after almost a year, says the stories upon stories, after almost a year of convincing the Pharaoh through 10 terrible, terrible plagues, that the Israelites should be let go. And in fact, that last plague, the infamous death of the firstborn Egyptian, or at least those who failed to put blood on the doorposts of their homes from their Passover sacrifices, that was a terrible plague that was the last one, and that really offered much more death than the other plagues. But after that plague, the Israelites went free. And there was that possible moment at the Red Sea when maybe the Israelites would get captive and would not be able to cross over. But God put a divider between the Israelites and the Egyptian army. God split that Red Sea. God caused all the Israelites to go through on basically dry ground. And as the Israelites ended their trek through the sea, the Egyptians began theirs through the sea, and God closed the waters upon all the Egyptians, killing them and being a lesson for those people who would harass the Israelites into the future. So that's the story of Passover. There are many ancillary parts of the story, and really we end that story not so much with the death of the firstborn and not so much with the death of the Egyptian soldiers, but we try to end that story with the fact that indeed the Israelites went free. And by the way, you'll see in this experience, we don't back away from those stories about the death of the Egyptian firstborn or the death of the Egyptian soldiers, because the Torah tells us not to cry. Or I should say the midrash, the stories upon stories, tells us we don't cry, we don't rejoice even when our enemies meet their fate. We are not bloodthirsty people. None of us is. Forget about just Israel. None of us is bloodthirsty. None of us rejoices when their enemies bite the dust. But it's important to know that our tradition does come back to those poor souls as well, and reminds us that one of the things that we talk about at Passover, and it is part of the Passover Seder, part of the Passover experience, is that we cannot rejoice over the death of even our enemies. Now, that's again 400 years and, well, I went over, maybe it was 400 years and 8 minutes. I'm sorry. But I want us to think for a moment. What does it feel like, do you think, to be a servant? What does it feel like to be a slave? What does it feel like to be a slave with 400 years of experience behind you, meaning your family were enslaved for 400 years in the land of Egypt, and then finally you are rescued? That is not an easy experience for any of us to imagine. Maybe we could, but the objective of the Passover observance, the objective of what we do, which is called a Seder, first of all, is to learn what kinds of emotions and these experiences might have felt like. It is an attempt to put ourselves in the shoes of another person who might have been a servant or a slave. And then when we find out what it was like, with meager food and work 7 days out of 7, and the hot sun beating down upon you. For those of you who have been to the land of Egypt, you know what that is like. With the hot sun beating down upon you and have to put out your work product every day, we might have a sense to know what that's like. And so when we find out and we learn and we imagine in ourselves what it's like to be a slave, we have to review then the events of the whole story as I've just reviewed it for us. We have to reflect on the meaning of these events of the Exodus. We have to then react internally, and then we react externally, and then we renew our commitment to lend a hand in something that we call the repair of an imperfect world. So we dedicate ourselves, as we renew our commitment, we rededicate ourselves to fixing the problems of the world. So at Passover time, we gather in families and we begin the process, but it by no means is over in one night of Passover, even though a Seder takes place in an evening. But this is a story that we think about and come to all the time, because it's imperative that we recall what it was like to be a slave, and it's imperative that we continually dedicate ourselves to making the world better, to eradicate the slavery, to eradicate the bigotry and persecution that is represented in today's world by the slavery that we read about in the Torah. Does it matter whether any of these stories are true or not? To some, it matters very much. And to some, their belief is so great that it certainly was true to them. But I think that if we can begin to put ourselves in the minds of those who were enslaved, then I don't think that it matters whether these stories were absolutely true or whether the Torah was being historical or rather simply being allegorical. These are important foundational kinds of concepts that we as human beings of any faith or no faith at all, we must understand that it's not imperative to empathize, but it helps to empathize what it is like to be a slave. And so we are commanded to indeed tell our children what it was like to be a slave. Now, I'm going to stop for a moment and talk about a meal, because who doesn't like to talk about food, right? On the first night of Passover, which this year is 48 hours from now, it's Saturday evening, the majority of Jews in the world, and there are exceptions, but we'll say the majority of Jews in the world who observe Passover, and in America, about 81% of American Jews observe Passover. It's the highest observed holiday in American Jewish life. They get together. With COVID, not so easy, obviously. Excuse me. But they might get together online. They might get together in their own family bubbles. They get together and they have something called a Seder. The Hebrew word seder is translated as order. And it is an order because we do certain things in a certain order, and that is uh, the telling of the story, the using of ritual foods, and the understanding of the plight of our ancestors. We retell the biblical story of the book of Exodus and of God saving the Israelites. Now, in this Seder, as I mentioned, there was some food, although dinner comes in the middle of the Seder. And in fact, some people spend an hour, in some homes 2 or 3 hours, telling the full story of the Exodus. And during that time, people are getting hungry and getting more hungry and trying to imagine then what it's like to be a slave and not have adequate amounts of food. You get little bits of food along the way, but actually those little bits of food might even make you hungrier. And so by the time dinner comes, you're starved and you're famished. And maybe that's part of the ability to empathize with what a slave's life might have been like. Let's think about what are these symbols of Passover. So I think probably the most ubiquitous of symbols is a piece of matzah. And I'm going to pull out a piece of matzah. And I can't see myself on screen, but I'm presuming you can see this. And you can certainly see matzah in my background illustration. A matzah is a sheet of matzah, usually comes 10 by 10 or 12 by 12 inches. Matzah is made of water and flour, usually wheat flour, although it can be made with other flours as well. For those with who are wheat sensitive, there are other alternatives that you can also find. And it's a very plain kind of bread. But this is the most ubiquitous and the most important symbol of the Passover holiday. In fact, what I want to do just for a moment is I want to share my screen and I want to share it and I want to share with you some words from the book that we use when we offer a Passover meal. Thank you. So what I want to do is share this with you. And these are words that are in what we call the Haggadah. The Haggadah is something that is a booklet. It could be a pamphlet. It usually is larger than a pamphlet, though. It is the order of service. I think in some houses of worship, they have an order of service. In some houses of worship, they have a prayer book. This is our prayer book. This is our order of service for this night of Passover. So both in Hebrew and in English, this paragraph that you see on screen is the most poignant of the words, the most poignant kind of words that we say on this night, right? In Hebrew, I'm going to read these words. These words are actually in Aramaic, not Hebrew, even though they appear to be in Hebrew characters. These words are in Aramaic, and below the translation, I'll offer them both. Ha lachma anya di achalu ahavatana be'ar'a de Mitzrayim. Kol dichtin yete veyehul, kol ditzrich yete veyifsach. Hashata hacha l'shana haba'a be'ar'a de Yisrael. Hashata avadei l'shana haba'a b'nei chorin. The translation, as you can see, this is the bread of deprivation that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Anyone who is hungry should come and eat. Anyone who is in need should come and partake of the Passover, or Pesach, here it says, sacrifice, which was a lamb. Now we are here. Next year we will be in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves. Next year we will be free people. The matzah that we eat, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. We'll come back to these words, some of these words later on. The matzah that we eat, again, is a very simple bread. Here we call it the bread of deprivation. It is the bread of affliction in certain translations. It is the bread of poverty in another translation. For those of you familiar with the book of Exodus, you know that the Israelites, when they were told that now is the time that they're going to leave Egypt, they made bread but didn't have time for the bread to rise. And so they came out with something that might resemble these flat, and if you'll pardon my opinion, a little tasteless kinds of of, of wheat matzah. Um, and that's why we have matzah, because we remember the fact that the Israelites didn't have time to let their bread rise. Bread was such an essential staple meal back before. Another important characterization, or another important symbol of Passover, really it's a combination of two, but the most important symbol is probably something that might be hard for you to see because it's liquid in here. This is a little dish of salt water. And the salt water we have on the Seder table because it represents the tears that our ancestors shed during their time as slaves. This is one of those foods, actually, it's salted water. It may make you a little hungry. And you have this right at the beginning of the Seder service. So this is something that might bring on a little bit of hunger. But this salt water is something that is truly, again, helping us empathize what it was like to shed these tears and collect them. Later on, we'll learn that we dip twice. We dip certain foods in another twice on this Seder night. But the thing that I'd like to do now, I'd like to ask Rabbi Margulis, if you would, Rabbi, to please maybe share your screen, or actually not share your screen, but to show us where you are, and so that you can share with us something called a Seder plate. And a Seder plate is something that, if you don't mind describing it, or I will, however you want to proceed, Rabbi.
Yeah, so I sent you all instructions to make your own Seder plate. So this is a Seder plate that that actually my daughter made years and years ago. She was just looking at it and criticizing her 10-year-old self for her lack of being able to paint within the lines. So it says Pesach in the middle, which is the Hebrew word for Passover. And then each of the 6 indentations is where the 6 major symbols of the Seder get placed. And then the names of those elements are in Hebrew, so you know where to put everything and so you don't forget what you're putting on your plate. And a Seder plate can look a lot of different ways. They don't have to be round. I have another one that was made in Israel that's square, and that has pretty pictures. I don't know how well you can see the pretty pictures. And again, it has the Hebrew names of all of the different elements. It may not look like Hebrew that you're familiar with seeing. This is Hebrew script. And so you can have a Seder plate that looks all different ways, that are modern, that are traditional, that are made out of pottery, that are made out of metal, that can be made out of olive wood, that can be made out of anything really. And they have the different symbols. So I sent you all the list of what goes on your Seder plate. Beitzah, a roasted egg, chazeret, some sort of lettuce, preferably a bitter kind of lettuce, karpas, parsley, charoset, and we'll talk about the charoset, zroa, which is usually a roasted lamb bone, but for the vegetarians among us, we use a roasted beet instead. And maror, which is a bitter herb, which usually is horseradish. So those are some of the symbols, in addition to the salt water and the wine and the matzah and a couple of special cups that Rabbi Biatch will talk about.
Right, thank you. So let me talk about that right now. A long time ago, when the Seder was sort of put together, and over the years, actually, the Seder has changed and modified throughout Jewish time. One of the symbols on our Seder table is a cup of the fruit of the vine. And I'm going to try and remember to use the phrase fruit of the vine because, there are some people among us who prefer wine, some people among us who prefer grape juice, some people among us who prefer tomato juice. That's grown on a vine, I think. Pumpkins are also grown on vines. And so probably at Hogwarts, they might have had, using their pumpkin juice, they might have been able to say the blessings over fruit of the vine as well. But for those of you who can see, there's a word here on this goblet, on this cup, and the word in Hebrew is Eliyahu, or in English, Elijah. So there's a part of our Seder service which is dedicated to the memory of the prophet Elijah, who, according to our custom, was the only prophet who did not die a natural death, but indeed ascended to heaven in a fiery chariot, never to be heard from again, except our tradition tells us that Elijah will return to earth as the harbinger of the Messiah. And it's possible that the Messiah can come really at a lot of different times, but certainly on this holiday, when we celebrate the redemption of the Israelite people, perhaps we are wishing for our whole world at this moment, which is in such peril, to be redeemed as well. So if Elijah were to come to our Seder tables and to be with us, that's a sign that the Messiah is not far behind. And so we put a cup of wine or grape juice or some other kind of fruit of the vine on the table, maybe as sort of an enticement to welcome Elijah if he were to come and visit us this year. There are many different customs about how we fill Elijah's cup. I can talk about them later if we have time, but this is one of the important goblets, one of the important cups that we have on our table. In later years, and actually within the last 20 years or so, we have another special goblet on our Seder table. And this is a goblet that is dedicated to Miriam, who in the book of Exodus is called Miriam the prophetess, who is the sister of Moses and Aaron. And we honor Miriam partially because we wanted to sort of make sure we had women represented in our Seder experience. All these male patriarchs, which used to be only the people that we talked about, needed to be offset by talking about the women in our lives as well. But more importantly, there are midrashim, again, those stories upon stories that talk about the fact that the people of Israel, through their 40-year trek through the desert, could not have existed without Miriam, because Miriam brought along with her water. Wherever Miriam lived, a miraculous well existed as well. Whenever the Israelites moved from place to place, water in this well or the well traveled with them. So there was always available water. And this is a goblet full of water. And so we remember the memory of Miriam as well as we go through the desert. Now, in addition to the cup of Elijah and the cup of Miriam, we also, each of us sitting around the Seder table, partake of wine ourselves or partake of the fruit of the vine. For many years, we spoke about 4 cups of wine, and there are 4 cups of the fruit of the vine, rather, that are consumed during the Seder service. One right at the beginning, one after the whole retelling of the story is complete, one after the meal, and one right at the very end of the Seder, because there's a little bit of worship service after the meal. In our tradition, I should say at Temple Bethel, we've actually added a 5th cup of wine, which really goes and speaks about it's sort of, in my mind, it actually evens out all of the various numbers of cups of wine, all of the promises, really, that God made to the Israelites when the Israelites were waiting to be freed from slavery. And I'm going to share my screen again, because I'd like to share with you some text here. Another bit of text, not from the Haggadah, but this is text from, this is text from the 6th chapter of Exodus. As you can see here, it's Exodus 6, chapter 6, verses 2 through 11. Within this little segment of Torah text, God makes 5 promises to the Israelites. God says, and God is talking to Moses at this time, and God is saying, these are my promises to you. I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians. That's the first promise. I will deliver you from their bondage. That's the second promise. The third promise, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and through extraordinary chastisements or plagues, to put it in different terms. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. And you'll know that I, the Eternal, am your God who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians. That's the 4th promise. And the 5th promise is, I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession, I, the Eternal. So again, in Exodus chapter 6, God makes these 5 promises to the Israelites through Moses. And these were, if you will, these were essential covenants that Moses made with the Israelites, and that God made with the Israelites as well. Now, what are some of the rituals that we do here? Well, let's see. One of the things that we do, and this is for some houses, first of all, every house actually eats matzah. So we have matzah, and I have a towel below me too, because matzah can generate a lot of crumbs. So when you have matzah, be prepared to do some cleanup. But anyway, there's a point in the Seder service later on, after we've told the story and we understand what matzah is and we understand what God is, we break apart matzah into small pieces and we eat of it. We eat one piece of matzah plain. Yep, that's matzah, all right. You have to, it's an acquired taste, but it is plain. But now we get to also eat it with different other symbols. Before, Rabbi Margulis had spoken about the charoset, and I know that she emailed charoset to everybody. And so you emailed 2 recipes, Rabbi, is that correct? So we emailed a Sephardi charoset, and the major part of that recipe is dates with nuts and some fruit zest in it. And the other charoset is Ashkenazi charoset, and that's made with apples, fruit of the vine, almonds, in our case, and cinnamon. Now, Sephardi means the people who came from the North Africa area, from the Mediterranean area, and from the Arab Peninsula. And they were the ones who had the more dried fruit. The Ashkenazim among Jews come from Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, that area, and they eat the apples and the cinnamon and the almonds and the fruit of the vine as well. Whatever your choice is, one of the things that we do, at that moment, there's another kind of symbol, and that symbol is the horseradish. We in our house like white horseradish. You can use red horseradish. You can use any kind. We get the processed kind. Some people actually take a horseradish root and cut it up into slices, and they use that. And it's very bitter. Horseradish, as we know, is very hot and bitter, but the root is just plain bitter. But for this particular ritual, we actually take some of the horseradish and put it on the matzah like that. And then we take some of the charoset. I'm going to use the Sephardi charoset because I particularly like it. And we add that together. And what we do, again, as the rabbi mentioned earlier, the horseradish is the sign of the bitterness and the terrible taste that slavery leaves in your mouth. The charoset, even though this is sweet, it's supposed to represent the mortar, the cement that was used to put buildings together. The ritual here is that we're eating the horseradish because we're supposed to think about the harshness of slavery, the bitterness of slavery, the heat of the experience. But because we shouldn't get too bitter, we also soften that by the sweet charoset. And we eat this together at one point during the Seder. That's really good. I think that people like horseradish in this part of the country, but at least I see Bucky Badger brand horseradish around, so I know that people here like that. And if you have these foods where you are, please be sure to partake as well.
Rabbi, is there maybe like some sort of blessing or something that we say as we eat these ritual foods?
Thank you for asking that question. That's a wonderful question. When we do many of the rituals, not all of them, interestingly enough, but when we do many of these rituals, we actually say a blessing. And the blessing is a blessing. We thank God through the blessings that we have. We offer gratitude to God for allowing us to participate in these rituals. So the blessing that we might offer at this time are really 2 blessings. One, I actually talked about 2 different rituals, 3 blessings. One is thanking God for the permission, the annual permission that we have of engaging in the eating of matzah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al achilat matzah. And then we also thank God for allowing us to eat bread, which is really, it's sort of the start of our meal. And we say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Sorry. We thank God for bringing forth bread from the earth. Now, of course, we know that God doesn't bring forth bread from the earth, but God, in a partnership with humanity, God allows us to harvest the ingredients for bread and then create matzah and other breads as well. When we offer God the blessing for the bitterness of slavery, it's not the bitterness of slavery really that we're saying that we're grateful for. We're grateful for the ability to celebrate this holiday when we can begin to empathize. And we say this blessing, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al achilat maror. We thank God, we praise God, who as the sovereign of the universe makes us holy through commandments and allows us and demands and commands us to eat the bitter herbs of maror. Since I already eaten that, then I'm just going to leave that as it is for now, because there's one other ritual that we come to. Here is a ritual that we do, and we don't offer a blessing for this particular ritual, and that is the ritual of what we call korech. Korech is a word, don't remember what korech means, Rabbi. Can you help me with that? I don't know. Korech means
Doesn't it mean breaking?
I think maybe so. But we take some maror, we take some of the horseradish and put it between two pieces of matzah, and it looks like a sandwich. And in fact, we have called this a Hillel sandwich because the sage Hillel, who lived in the 1st century before the Common Era, he would take matzah and maror, and he would actually take some of the Paschal sacrifice, some of the lamb, and eat it here too. So you can imagine what lamb and horseradish and bread would be. Not bad. But he would eat a sandwich like this, and he would say, I do this in remembrance of the fact that God said we should eat these foods. We should remember the night we left Egypt. The book of Exodus says that everyone was standing around waiting. Their loins were girded, whatever that means, and they ate their dinner in haste. We get to relax when we have these foods, but they said we eat with great haste. And so we do, and so it's hot. What else? Earlier on, I think I mentioned, is the time that we take some parsley. And we take the parsley, which is representative of the fact that the holiday of Passover always happens in the spring. Our calendar is a lunar calendar, but we intercalate. We have leap years in order to enable the seasonal holidays to take place, to fall in their appointed seasons. There are other lunar calendars where that doesn't happen. The calendar of Islam is one that we know of, that it sort of changes its dates quite greatly over the time of a year. But we don't. So we recognize that this is the springtime. We take parsley, we dip that in the salt water, and we say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al achilat. No, I'm totally wrong. So I was skipping ahead. We say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei pri ha'adama. We thank God for the fruit of the earth. And we dip the parsley in the salt water, and we offer that as well. That's toward the beginning. As I mentioned before, it's toward the beginning of the service as well. As Rabbi mentioned, we have a baked beet on our Seder plate because of the vegetarian we have in our home. So we honor Passover that way. We have an egg, a hard-boiled egg, which represents the sacrifice that happened on every one of the pilgrim festivals as sort of the pilgrim festival sacrifice. We have a hard-boiled egg. Sometimes the egg can be roasted in an oven, can be boiled. And we also have this on the Seder plate. And this is a Seder, this is an item for the Seder plate, which is relatively new. This is only 35-ish years old that we've been putting oranges on our Seder plate. And why do we put an orange on our Seder plate? There have been many times throughout the past 60, 70, 80 years when people have added new traditions. And one of the new traditions is to think about the Israelites, to think about the Jews who aren't sitting with us tonight. So for example, the number of matzot, we have the matzah that we have is kept in a special cover, which is called a matzah cover, oddly enough. And our matzah cover, we have a number of different kinds of matzah cover. They can be made of cloth, they can be made of ceramic, they can be made of all kinds of things, metal even. Our matzah cover looks like this. And these are Ethiopian Jews. And they have, that's the land of Israel there in the background. But there are many different kinds of matzah covers. Rabbi, maybe you want to show one that you have over there. You have a slightly different one. And you have to say something, I think, so people can hear you or can see you.
So this one has a lot of text on it. I don't know where this came from. Do you remember where you got this?
I think I bought that in Israel at some point.
Yeah. So the text that it has on it is it's a reading that we have during the Seder. And the reading says, Manishtana halayla hazeh mikol haleilot. What makes this night different from all other nights? And we call it the 4 questions, but it's really one question with 4 answers. So why is this night different from all other nights? And it's traditional that the youngest child says this prayer and chants it. So there's a lot of pressure on the youngest child to do this. Shebechol halelot anu ochlin chametz umatzah halayla hazeh kulo matzah. That all other nights we eat leavened or unleavened bread, and on this night we only eat unleavened bread. Shebechol halelot anu ochlin sha'ar yirakot halayla hazeh kulo maror. All other nights we eat all kinds of green things, all kinds of vegetables, but this night we only eat bitter herbs or bitter vegetables. Shebechol halelot anu ochlin bein yoshvin uvein misubin, halayla hazeh kulanu misubin. All other nights we eat sitting up or we eat reclining or something in between, but on this night we eat reclining. Shebechol halelot ein anu matbilin afilo pa'am echat, halayla hazeh shtei fe'amim. On all other nights we don't dip even once, but on this night we dip twice. So we dip the parsley in the salt water to remember the bitterness and the tears of slavery, and we dip our matzah into the haroset to remember the hard labor and the bread of affliction and the mortar that the Israelites had to make. So that's the matzah cover, and that matzah cover came with a smaller covering, and this is for the afikoman. So we, as Rabbi Biatch said, it's a very long service. Dinner very often doesn't come until an hour or a couple of hours, depending on how much of the service you do. And we have to keep the kids entertained. So there's a lot of things that we do to keep the kids entertained. A lot of singing, a lot of, asking about the symbols, a lot of asking them to do things like lead the 4 questions. One of the things that we do is we take a piece of matzah at the beginning of the Seder, we put it in a little bag, and we hide it someplace. And so during the meal, while the adults are lingering over their dinner and chatting and gossiping and whatever, that we can, and the kids finish their food in like 5 minutes flat, right? So then we send them off on a matzah hunt. So they hunt all around the house, and the Talmud says that you cannot finish your Seder until everybody has had a taste of the afikoman. So the child who finds the afikoman has the power, because we stay there all night until somebody redeems the afikoman from them. So they bargain with one of their parents to get a quarter. Well, in my day it was a quarter. I'm really old. I think they get a couple of bucks now for their afikoman, whoever finds it.
I think maybe it's one of the last things because we're coming up upon 10 to 8, Rabbi, and you can tell me if we need to stop at 8 or if people want to stay on, we can stay on for a little bit longer. But I especially want to share something with you now on screen. I mentioned earlier on that it is our custom not to gloat over the fallen. It is our custom to indeed slap ourselves on the wrist when we try and say how joyful we are when a foe has been killed. And so I want to share with you one of the pages from our Haggadah. Again, that's the booklet, that's the order of service that we have and that we use at the Seder meal itself. And this particular, again, this Haggadah um, is something as a book that my synagogue published about a year ago, just before the pandemic started. We had, in fact, we had our splash, our debut of our book, and a week later, everything closed down. No cause and effect there. But what I want to do is to share with you one of the most striking parts of the Haggadah, whether it's ours or anybody else's. It's the time when we say to one another, we can't rejoice when our enemies fall. And indeed, we have to lessen our joy when our enemies fall. We might be overjoyed that we are going to freedom, but the fact that people fall is not something that we're proud of. And so before I share this with you, I want you to think backwards for a moment. I want you to think of right to left. I want you to think of how Hebrew is read. I want you to think of how, and that's how Hebrew is read, right to left. And I want to share with you this book. This is a 2-page spread, a double spread in the book, to share with you these illustrations. These are the 10 plagues. These are the 10 plagues that were visited upon the Egyptians, beginning in the 8th chapter of Exodus and going through the 13th, or the beginning of the 13th chapter of Exodus. And in our book, as you will see right here, we have, I'm going to go to full screen. There we go. So if you read across from right to left, we have these 10 plagues that many are familiar with. The plague of blood, frogs, vermin, wild animals, cattle disease, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and the death of the firstborn. And one of the most, in my mind, one of the most important rituals that we do is that we will take our cups of fruit of the vine and fill them to the top. And then we pour off a little by little by little every time we say one of these plagues. And we recite all 10 right in a row in a very slow manner, because we want to really understand what it is to have a plague visited upon us. And we want to understand what it's like when those plagues take away our loved ones or others' loved ones even. So we say dam, blood, sfardea, frogs, kinim, vermin, arov, wild animals, dever, cattle disease, shechin, boils, barad, hail, arbe, locusts, choshech, darkness, makat bechorot, the death of the firstborn. And every time we say one of these plagues, every time we utter one of the plagues, we pour off some of our wine. Some people use their fingers, some people pour, whatever it is. But we are to lessen our joy in a symbolic way, because we don't gloat over the fallen. And we say to ourselves, even our enemies deserve a break. Now, the story of the Seder is something that takes place in 15 steps. That's how many steps there are in this order, in this Seder. And some of them have blessings attached to them, some of them don't. Some of them have food attached to them, some of them don't. But I hope that you all have the opportunity one day to partake in one of the Seder experiences and to see what it is like, indeed, to have a Seder and to go through this experience and really understand what it's like to perhaps understand a little bit, really, of what it's like to be enslaved, what it's like to be persecuted, and come out of the Seder dedicating yourself to saying, I'm going to stop this persecution that I know about in our world. I'm not going to let this persist. And indeed, that's what our goal is for this holiday and for all the things that we do in our community. Certainly, as Reformed Jews, we take a look at the world and we say that injustice, indignity will not persist in our world. And we get inspired and we get thrilled by learning these things through the Passover Seder. Rabbi, that is my presentation for tonight. I'm happy to.
That was great. Thank you. Can we take some questions?
Yeah.
Feel free to unmute yourselves. Because we have such a wonderful turnout, I can't see everybody all at once. So if you're raising your hand or something, I can't see you. So feel free to just unmute yourself.
So what did you mean by recline?
So because we are free, when you're a slave, you have no choice about where you eat, what you eat, and how much time you have to eat. You have to eat in haste because you have to get back to work. But when you are free to recline and relax and take your time. And so one of the customs is to bring your pillow with you to the table. So you can have your pillow, so you can be cozy, comfy, and kind of lounge. So the Seder is kind of patterned on, if you've ever watched movies that take place in ancient Rome, and they're always having a feast, and they're all like laid out on their chaise lounge, right? And somebody's passing around lots of little hors d'oeuvre things, and they dip vegetables into different things. So that's kind of what, and it's a symposium feast. So there was always somebody who was giving some kind of lesson or teaching a philosophical treatise or something while people were eating. So that's kind of what the Seder is patterned after. And so while we eat, we're supposed to be sort of lounging and relaxing and being sort of indulgent. Of course, it's really uncomfortable to eat that way. So most people don't really do that. But that's what the reclining refers to.
In the materials you sent, Rabbi, the reference to the eggs was the circle of life. That was it seemed like a little bit different than what we heard tonight. I wonder if you could clarify what the meaning is or significance of the egg and how we eat it.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, you don't eat it. It's really that's one of the symbols you don't consume. You may, and in fact, many Jewish families, the families make hard-boiled eggs or deviled eggs of some kind, and they actually do consume eggs during it. The egg that you have on your main Seder plate usually is just for show, like this. There are two symbols again on the Seder plate that represent the ancient sacrifices. One is the egg, which in a way does represent the fullness of life, because the three pilgrim festivals in Jewish practice was Passover now, there was a Tabernacles holiday in the fall, a harvest holiday, and a Pentecostal, or Pentecost, I think is maybe a word that you might get, I don't know, but it's the time when Torah was revealed, when the Bible, when the commandments on Mount Sinai were revealed. And those three holidays sort of represent the fullness of the growth and the fullness of the agricultural cycle. So indeed, the egg represents that as well. It represents a number of different things, rather than only one particular set of understandings. And the other, of course, the other sacrifice is the beet, or the lamb's bone, which represents the specific paschal sacrifice that is mentioned for Passover. Excuse me.
So I'm a little confused about Seder and Passover. Seder is held during a Passover?
You want to go for that, Bonnie?
Yeah, so Passover is the name of the holiday, or in Hebrew Pesach, because the angel of death Pasach, or passed over the Israelites' houses for the last plague. So the holiday, which is a 7 or 8 day holiday, depending on whether you observe 7 days or 8 days, and during that holiday, the first 2 nights the first 2 days and nights are holy, and the last night is holy, and then the ones in between are sort of the intermediate days. And so the first night or the first 2 nights, depending on your custom, we hold a Seder. So the Seder is the name of the ritual meal, which is the main observance for the holiday. So the 2 main observances for the holiday is to hold a Seder, to hold this ritual meal, and to eat matzah during the week and not eat anything that's leavened. So the weeks before Passover, Jews spend a lot of time cleaning out their house and getting rid of all leaven. So breads, cakes, cookies, crackers, anything that's leaven, it all goes away. Some people literally get it out of their houses. Some people just shut it away in a cabinet somewhere. And we substitute matzah and other Passover appropriate foods. So you can go into the grocery store and go into the kosher food aisle, and you'll see at this time of year, like boxed cake mixes and brownie mixes and things. Those are kosher for Passover brownies. They don't rise. They have no leaven ingredient to them. I leave it to your imagination what the quality of them is. So some of them are better than others.
I think that's a
lot of
fair
time.
statement. Yes, some of them are
Yes,
better than others.
some of them are better than others. We substitute other kinds of things like potato flour instead of wheat flour, and other kinds of things that we're allowed to have during this week.
So is Seder held other times during the year?
No.
No.
Well, actually, I shouldn't say that so
No,
fast.
okay. Yeah, I think that traditionally not, but in fact, a 400-year-old custom became custom in that there's a holiday that we observe when the growing season, I should say when the winter time in Israel starts to disappear and the land starts to warm. In Hebrew, the holiday is called Tu B'Shvat, which simply means the 15th day of the month of Shvat, which is one of the lunar months. And it's the holiday again when things start to grow, when sap actually starts to run in the trees. And it's about a 400 or 500-year-old custom to have a Seder meal, to think about the agricultural life of the land of Israel. It's not really a meal so much, although you can have a meal, but it really is speaking about all of the fruits and all of the produce that Israel is about to now produce for that next growing season. So some people call that a Seder. And go ahead, Rabbi, maybe there are others that you wanted to mention too.
No, that was basically it. But the Passover Seder is the traditional Seder that we've been observing for almost 2,000 years, really since the temple was destroyed in the year 70.
Yeah, that other Seder is just a youngster.
Yeah, right. So the Tu B'Shvat Seder was patterned after the Passover Seder and is a way of honoring what's called the 7 species, 7 different foods that are native to Israel.
Thank you.
I was wondering you said there were 15 steps basically to the meal.
Yes.
Are there other stories that you tell besides the Passover and Exodus story?
During the course of the Seder, and when you look through, I think we've sent you a link to to a flip book version of the Haggadah. When you look through that and you look through some of the texts, you will find a number of different stories. One of the steps of the Seder, I believe it's step number 5, is in Hebrew, the word is magid. In English, that word translates as the telling. And it's during that telling part that we rabbis and that the rabbis who gave us this ceremony, again, this 2,000-year-old ceremony, they actually weave together a number of stories that they knew to teach us lessons about the holiday. For example, one of the stories is that, one of the customs, I should say, is that we're not supposed to linger over the meal overly long. We're supposed to finish our meal by midnight. And one of the stories that this book tells, and you can read it yourself in the book, is the story of 5 rabbis who were caught, if you will. They were caught in a cave somewhere, and their Passover Seder was going all night. And they lost track of time, according to the context of the story. They lost track of time until their students came to them at 5 in the morning and said, "Masters, you have to stop your Passover Seder. The sun is coming up. It's time for the morning worship service." Now, that's what we call the pshat, and that's a Hebrew word that means that's the simple, basic, bare bones meaning. We don't know whether this actually happened, but one of the interesting stories upon stories that could be told about this incident is not that the rabbis were up all night telling the story of the Exodus, because you could do that very simply over the dinner hour, over the length of the Seder, but actually this was happening at a time of the revolt of the Israelites, or the revolt of the Judeans actually, over Rome, the revolt that lasted from 132 to 135 of the Common Era, and that these rabbis may have been rabbis, they may have been other people, but they actually were up all night plotting strategy against the Romans. So there's an underlying meaning to many of the stories that you find there. There is the story of, it's not really so much a story, but I think Rabbi Margulis mentioned this before, the 4 questions. Why is it that this night is so different from all other nights? Another story that we tell is a story about 4 kinds of children and the 4 learning styles that is necessary to teach the children the meaning of this holiday. You have the wise child, the arrogant or assertive child. You have the simple child, and you have a child that doesn't even know what to ask. They're so unconnected to what we're doing here, meaning either by youth or by demeanor. And so how you tell the story of the Exodus to each of those kinds of children is part of that telling of the story. And also the other part of the telling, just to be, I'm sorry, very, very, very long, but the Bible stories that make up the Exodus, sometimes the rabbis dissect into very minute phrases, and they define a word or a phrase. And sometimes you'll see that sort of explosion of the biblical text, and very carefully they'll go through and they will say, what does it mean? What does signs and wonders mean? What does outstretched arm mean? And very carefully take certain phrases and try to define them. Those are like stories as well. So there are many stories here in the Haggadah that people tell. Other questions?
I don't have a question, but I have an observation. Years ago, studying the Exodus story, after I came back actually from El Salvador, the base Christian communities really loved the story of the Exodus. It was very, very important to them. And I came back and was rereading it. And I appreciated tonight your inclusion of Miriam. I think, as we all know, women are often written out of history. So I appreciate her inclusion tonight. But as I was thinking about it, there was Miriam, and then of course Miriam got her mother involved, although she didn't identify her as her mother. She said she was a nurse. And then the Pharaoh's, was it his wife or the sister that protected
his daughter.
Yeah. So really, those 3 women were all committing civil disobedience, and I thought
Plus the midwives.
Yeah, the midwife, 4 of them. Yeah, all of them at risk of their own lives to protect this little boy baby. And I think that's a part of this story that we don't talk about, or we don't think about it. It's usually not even in the story, but when I was reading it, I thought, wow, that's such an exciting and beautiful part of that story, and such an affirmation of women and women's willingness to nurture this child at risk of their own lives. So
and to resist. I mean, another thing we talk about is the resistance of these midwives who, at threat of their own life, they disobeyed the order of the Pharaoh. Right. Thank you.
Any other questions?
So I have a question about herbs. In European herb lore, horehound is considered a bitter herb. I Googled it this afternoon, and it looks like in the Middle Ages, it was actually part of the Seder. So I had some popping up today, and I'm wondering if anyone in the US is actually using that instead of horseradish or in addition to it. If there's any lore around this European herb. It's from Northern Europe, in Germany and some parts of Europe for that.
It's a
It's
medicinal
bitter.
herb, is that right? It's a medicinal herb,
And
right?
it's very bitter, very bitter. It's used in cough drops. You probably heard of horehound cough drops with a lot of sugar, but it's really bitter.
Yeah, I've only ever heard of horehound candy, and I think I usually read it in, like, I don't know, like Louisa May Alcott novels or something.
It actually is still available. I buy it once in a while. You can get it at Woodman's. My mother used to use that. I think she just liked to have something in her mouth at all times. So, but
I've never heard of being used in connection with the Seder. No.
it's possible that it is. It's like as you found it, so other people could find it as well, but we're not sure.
Anyone else? Well, I hope if you haven't had a chance to make one of the haroset recipes, I hope that you do. My son made the Sephardic one yesterday, and he used, oh, did you use it? Did you make it, Sarah? Was it good? That's great. My son made it yesterday. He put lots of orange zest in it, so it kind of tastes like just really sweet orange marmalade, and I love orange marmalade. So I don't like dates at all, but it was really good, what he made. So I hope you all had a chance to make it, because if you like those ingredients, it's really good. My daughter loves Ashkenazic haroset, the apples and nuts and grape juice and honey and cinnamon. Simplest thing in the world to make, those 5 ingredients, and she just loves it. So I wanted you all to have a taste of Passover, because when we were talking about this experience and what it would be like, Samantha said, you know, the thing that I always remember and that I love best about Passover is the taste. And if they can't have a Seder, how are they going to have a taste of Passover? So that's why I thought, oh, well, tell them to make haroset.
What is the other, you said that the egg is one of the things that you don't eat. It's symbolic, but of the other 5 items that you talked about, what's the other one that you don't eat?
So there are actually 3 items on the Seder plate that you would eat. You would eat the parsley, you would eat this haroset, and you would eat the horseradish. People don't eat the roasted shank bone, and they don't eat the egg. I mean, they could, but they're there really for the most of the meal to be more decorative. That's the wrong word. To be more
symbolic.
Symbolic. Thank you. For the whole meal itself. And the other sort of bitter lettuce, which is called chazeret in Hebrew. But again, some people simply have a Seder plate with all of these ingredients on them for the symbols of the holiday, and then they have other serving dishes. You have a little bit of haroset. This little bowl of haroset is probably 2.5 inches in diameter. It's very small, but you would have this on the Seder plate completely and leave it there. But then, because people make big amounts of food, you have another big bowl of haroset elsewhere on the table. And that's what you eat from, and you maintain the integrity of the foods on the Seder plate. That's totally up to you.
Anyone else? Thank you all so much. I would love to tell you when the next sacred site visit is, but I can't remember. I think I know that we are going to Circle Sanctuary toward the end of April, but I think there's something before that. But Selena, do you want to say a couple words about what we're going to experience at Circle Sanctuary?
Yes, well, we're still closed due to the pandemic, so we will have some exploration of some of our ceremonial areas. Circle Sanctuary is based near Barneveld, Wisconsin, and one of our ministers has, for his birthday a few months ago, got a drone. So we'll have, hopefully all will come together and you'll have a chance to see our sacred Spring, our Stone Circle, and some other areas. And I will be sharing some of our symbols and some of our traditions as part of it. Those who want to actually take, that will be the 24th of April in the morning at 9:30 in the morning. Those of you who might want to come back for more, in the afternoon is our public Earth Day celebration. So that we'll have some more information up at the Circle Sanctuary website. And yeah, so everybody's welcome to come. And I'm really enjoying these virtual sacred site visits and very thankful I got to learn a whole lot tonight. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Selena. Mary, is there something before April 24th?
Well, the iftar.
Yes, thank you. So on April 15th at 7:15, and there's a reason for the rather odd starting time, we are going to have our annual Interfaith Ramadan Iftar. Iftar is usually it's a potluck break the fast meal. We've had them for, this will be our 5th year. Yes, I think that's right. The first 3 years were all in person, and we shared food and prayer and learning and fellowship, and it was wonderful. Last year we did, because of the pandemic, we did an online fundraiser for 7 area food banks. This year we're combining. We're going to have a program. It is still going to be virtual, unfortunately, but that's the way it is. So we're going to have a virtual iftar. We're going to have a chance to have some learning about Ramadan and iftar and zakat, which is the Arabic word for charity. And it will also be a fundraiser for Second Harvest Food Bank, and will be the kickoff to a month of fundraiser that will coincide with the month of Ramadan. So we will be sending out information about that shortly. And we have a goal of raising $4,000 for Second Harvest. And if we make that goal, we will get an additional $1,000 from our anonymous donor. So please do help us make that match. So be on the lookout for information about our virtual iftar on April 15th and about our visit to Circle Sanctuary on April 24th. And Selena, if you can be sure that I have the information about the afternoon event, because for the Jewish community, Saturday morning is difficult, but some people might be willing to and be interested to attend the afternoon event. So that would be great. Thank you all so much. I'm really gratified by the turnout, not just tonight, but for all the visits that we've had so far and all the folks who've signed up for the year. And actually, Mary has been working so hard, and we have dates well into 2022 lined up. So we have a lot of wonderful experiences ahead of us. Thank you all so much. For those of you who are observing, have a wonderful Passover. For those who are observing Easter, have a very fulfilling Easter. And we will see you for the beginning of Ramadan.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Night all.
Wonderful.
Good night, everyone.
Thank
Thank you. Good night.